The summer of 1943 was unlike any other in Germany. After years of Nazi dominance and confidence, dark clouds began to gather. This time, not metaphorically, but literally. On the night of July 24th, the people of Hamburg looked up to see the faint drone of engines, dozens at first, then hundreds. The air itself trembled. It wasn't just another raid. This was the beginning of Operation Gomorrah, a plan so vast, so devastating, that it would change the face of modern warfare forever. As the first RAF bombers crossed the coastline, they carried with them a new weapon. Window, thin strips of aluminum foil designed to blind German radar. In seconds, the skies became chaos for the Luftwaffe. Radar screens went white. Sirens blared, but it was already too late. The apocalypse had begun. At RAF bases across England, pilots had been briefed on a mission of unprecedented scale. 700 bombers in one night, targeting Hamburg's industrial heart. The British called it the Battle of Hamburg. But to those who witnessed it, it was hell on earth. The first wave dropped thousands of incendiary bombs. Small but lethal devices meant not just to explode, but to burn everything they touched. Within minutes, the city's rooftops were ablaze. Wooden beams ignited, glass shattered, and oil tanks burst into rivers of fire. The night sky turned orange, then crimson, as smoke billowed so high it was visible from 200 miles away. Pilots looked down and whispered on their radios, "God, it's like the end of the world." But what no one expected was the birth of something new. Something the world had never seen before. A firestorm. The sheer number of incendiaries, combined with perfect weather and tightly packed buildings, created an unstoppable inferno. Winds exceeding 150 miles per hour pulled oxygen into the heart of the blaze, feeding it until entire streets were sucked into a vortex of fire. Witnesses said people were literally lifted off the ground by the heat, their clothes bursting into flames. Even German firefighters, veterans of countless raids, were powerless. They called it Feuerhölle, the fire hell. It was no longer a bombing raid, it was nature itself, weaponized. Back in England, Allied Command monitored the operation with awe. For the first time, they realized the potential of strategic bombing not just to cripple industry, but to break morale. Intelligence intercepts revealed chaos in the German civil defense. Radio operators screamed into static. Power grids collapsed. The once proud Nazi propaganda machine went silent. Even Joseph Goebbels, the master of lies, called it a catastrophe without precedent. The RAF knew this was more than just a military victory. It was psychological warfare. Yet among some commanders, there was unease. Had they gone too far? Could any city deserve this level of annihilation? No one dared ask out loud. In the following nights, the Americans joined in. The U.S. 8th Air Force launched daylight raids, while the RAF struck by night. The constant hammering left Hamburg in ruins. Over 37,000 civilians were killed, and more than 180,000 buildings were destroyed. The once mighty port city was reduced to ash. Survivors described it as if the sun had fallen on Hamburg. Yet amid the devastation, one truth became clear. This was the turning point of air warfare. The Allies had proven they could burn through the heart of Nazi Germany without ever setting foot on the ground. From that point on, Germany would never again feel safe, even within its own borders. As the flames finally died, a gray dawn rose over what was once a thriving city. The streets were unrecognizable. Charred bodies, melted cars, the scent of burnt iron and despair. From the air, it looked as though Hamburg had been erased from the map. Pilots returning home were silent. Some refused their victory drinks. They had seen the future of war, and it was terrifying. Operation Gomorrah was hailed as a success, but even among its architects, there was a haunting realization. In mastering destruction, humanity had crossed a line it could never uncross. And for Germany, It was the moment they truly began to lose the war. It was the night of May 30th, 1942, the night when England's airfields became volcanoes ready to erupt. The rain had stopped just before dusk, but the runways still shimmered under the dim floodlights. Mechanics ran between the massive bombers, shouting orders drowned by the thunder of engines. The smell of oil, sweat, and adrenaline filled the air. Hundreds of Royal Air Force Lancaster and Halifax bombers were being armed with their deadly payloads. 4,000-pound cookies and incendiaries designed to burn an entire city to ash. Inside one bomber, 21-year-old Flight Lieutenant Arthur Green watched as the bombs were loaded beneath his aircraft. His crew was young, barely out of school, but tonight they were part of something never attempted before. Operation Millennium, the largest air raid in human history. As Arthur adjusted his flight goggles, he glanced down the airfield. Every runway was alive. Engines roaring, lights flickering, ground crews waving frantic signals. It was like watching a mechanical beast awaken from sleep. Behind him, his navigator joked nervously, "1,000 planes, Arthur. They'll see us coming from Berlin." Arthur didn't answer. He knew what it meant. Over 7,000 men flying into darkness, many never to return. Yet, as the signal flare shot into the sky, turning the clouds crimson, every bomber's engine growled in unison. The night had begun. At 10:45 p.m., the first bombers lifted off, their propellers slicing through the mist. Then another, then 100 more. For nearly 2 hours, the skies over England thundered with the roar of takeoff after takeoff. People in nearby towns came out of their homes just to watch. An endless stream of aircraft glowing faintly against the night sky, stretching toward the horizon. To the ground crews left behind, it was a sight of pride and dread, like watching an army march into the unknown. Inside Arthur's Lancaster, the crew settled into their rhythm. The radio crackled with coded chatter. "Squadron 83, maintain heading 092, altitude 15,000. The channel below reflected the faint moonlight, calm and deceptive. "It's too quiet," the rear gunner muttered. A few hours earlier, they had been laughing in the mess hall. Now, they sat in cold silence, every vibration of the engines a reminder of the mission's weight. Far ahead, the first radar echoes appeared on German screens. Searchlights flicked on near the coast, thin white spears scanning the heavens. The Germans were awake and waiting. By midnight, the first flak bursts began. Black clouds of shrapnel exploded in every direction, shaking the aircraft like toys in a storm. "Hold her steady!" Arthur shouted over the intercom as his bomber jolted from the impact wave. Tracer fire streaked upward from the ground, red lines slicing the darkness. The gunner called out, "Fighters! 2 o'clock high!" And in seconds, twin-engine Messerschmitt night fighters were among them, spitting fire. The sky became chaos. Bombers burning, engines failing, men bailing out into the black void below. Arthur gritted his teeth and kept the plane on course. "Navigator, check heading!" he barked. "Still on target," came the reply, though the voice trembled. The air inside the cabin reeked of smoke and sweat. Through the front glass, the horizon ahead glowed faintly. Not the dawn, but the fires of Cologne already lit by the pathfinders. "There it is," whispered the bombardier. "The city of lights and death." The pilot flipped a switch, and the bomb bay doors began to open. "Steady, lads. This is it." Then the earth below erupted. At exactly 12:47 a.m., Arthur released his payload, and the world seemed to explode. Thousands of bombs fell through the clouds in a deadly rain, each one whistling before slamming into the city below. The shock waves rippled through the sky. Flames rose higher than the clouds. From the air, Cologne looked like it was melting. Entire districts consumed by walls of fire, roads glowing red like rivers of lava. The bombers above could feel the heat against their glass canopies. "My God," murmured the navigator, staring down in awe and horror. "We're burning a whole city." On the ground, chaos reigned. Civilians fled through streets that no longer existed, sirens wailing until they were silenced by collapse. The cathedral stood as a dark silhouette against an ocean of flame. Within 2 hours, more than 1,400 tons of explosives had fallen. The largest air raid in human history. The roar of the bombers mixed with the screams of the dying and the crackle of fire. And through it all, the RAF kept coming, wave after wave, until nothing below could burn any brighter. By 3 a.m., the last bomber turned west for home. The air was quieter now, only the hum of engines and the creak of damaged wings. Arthur's crew sat in silence, their faces pale and empty. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Through the rear window, the horizon still glowed red, a living wound across Germany. "We did it," said the co-pilot softly. "Cologne's gone." But Arthur didn't feel victorious. He just nodded and whispered, "Let's get home." The flight back was long and cold. Dozens of bombers never made it. Some shot down, others lost to the dark sea below. When Arthur's plane finally touched down on English soil at dawn, the ground crews cheered, counting survivors like ghosts returning from the dead. Newspapers the next morning called it a triumph of British air power. But to the men who flew, it felt like something else. The night they saw the world end from 15,000 feet. As the sun rose over the airfield, Arthur looked at the horizon one last time and thought, the sky will never look the same again. The night sky was a graveyard of flickering lights. The engines of hundreds of RAF bombers still thundered in the distance, faint and broken, as Arthur's Lancaster cut through the freezing winds above the North Sea. The glow of Hamburg, once a living city, still painted the clouds in shades of orange and red. It wasn't the gentle glow of sunrise. It was fire. Entire districts were burning, and from 20,000 feet, the men could see the inferno twisting through the smoke like a living creature. Inside the cockpit, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, oil, and cordite. The crew spoke little now. They had been in the air for nearly 8 hours, and the tension had begun to sink into their bones. Arthur's gloved hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the throttle. "How much fuel left?" he asked, his voice hoarse through the mask. "Barely enough," came the reply from the engineer. Silence followed. The only sound was the engine, steady, defiant, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Outside, the northern lights shimmered faintly on the horizon, but none of them were looking. They were too tired, too haunted. Behind them, the world burned. As the bombers began to scatter across the channel, the radio crackled with chaos. Echo 6-5 losing altitude. "Navigator down. Requesting heading to base. Oxygen low." The voices came and vanished like ghosts. Arthur turned his eyes to the formation ahead. But where there had once been a sky full of planes, there were now only a handful of distant silhouettes. "We started with 1,000, he whispered. "And now?" The tail gunner, barely 19, scanned the horizon through cracked glass. "Can you see them, Skipper?" Arthur shook his head. "Not anymore." Below them, the sea shimmered with oil and flame, the wreckage of the bombers that hadn't made it. Some had been hit by flak, others by German night fighters. A few had simply vanished, lost to the black waters below. Each loss was a friend, a memory, a piece of the 1,000. The radio fell silent again, and for the first time, Arthur wished it wouldn't. Even the sound of strangers dying had become less terrifying than the sound of nothing. The silence meant they were gone. When dawn broke over England, the returning bombers looked like a funeral procession. Mechanics, medics, and officers lined the runway, counting the aircraft one by one. 150, 152. Every number called out was a heartbeat of relief. Every pause meant another crew missing. Arthur's Lancaster touched down roughly, skidding across wet concrete. As the engines shut off, The sudden quiet felt unnatural, almost cruel. Ground crews ran forward, eyes wide as they examined the bullet-riddled fuselage. A young mechanic climbed up the ladder, staring at the torn metal near the tail. "You're lucky, sir," he muttered. "This one was close." Arthur nodded but said nothing. Around him, other crews climbed down from their aircraft, dirty, exhausted, and hollow-eyed. One man wept openly as he saw the empty spot where his best friend's plane should have landed. The hangars that once buzzed with laughter were silent now, filled only with the smell of fuel and grief. That morning, a cook brought coffee for the crews. No one touched it. The men stared at their hands, at the mud, at the horizon where their comrades had vanished. They had completed the mission. The city burned. And yet, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. Barely. In London, the war machine spun a different story. Headlines screamed, "Cologne burns!" The 1,000-bomber triumph. A tale of courage, of precision, of British supremacy. The people cheered in pubs, lifted glasses, and sang victory songs under dim lights. But the men who had flown that night didn't cheer. They read the papers in silence, their faces pale under the morning light. Arthur folded his newspaper carefully and looked at the photo on the front page. Flames swallowing a cathedral, streets reduced to ash. "They call it glory," he muttered. His friend, the navigator, shrugged. "Maybe it is, if you weren't there." For the first time, Arthur realized the gap between those who fought the war and those who watched it. The civilians saw numbers, tonnage, success. The airmen saw faces, screams, and ghosts in the smoke. That night, when London celebrated, Arthur walked to the airfield again. The wind was cold, carrying the faint smell of rain and burnt fuel. From a distance, he could hear music, a band playing for morale. But the notes felt hollow. The men who danced tonight would fly again tomorrow. Rain began to fall softly over the airfield, washing the soot from the wings of the bombers. Arthur stood beneath one of them, looking up at the dark belly of the machine that had carried him through hell and back. He could still hear the roar of the engines in his ears, even though they were silent now. Nearby, ground crews worked quietly on another plane, one that wouldn't fly again. Its nose was torn open, propellers twisted like broken bones. Arthur recognized the code number on the side. It belonged to Captain Mills, his friend since training. He reached out, resting a gloved hand on the cold metal. "You made it halfway," he whispered. The rain thickened, drumming against the hangars and puddles. Somewhere in the distance, a bugler began to play taps. The haunting tune drifted across the base, fading into the mist. Arthur closed his eyes and listened. Every note was a goodbye. Tomorrow, there would be another briefing, another mission, another list of names. But for now, there was only the sound of the rain and the memory of the fire still burning across the sea. In his mind, Arthur could still see Hamburg burning. The city's heart turned to ash, its people running beneath the storm of fire the bombers had unleashed. He didn't know whether they'd won anything that night, but he knew one thing for certain. The war had taken everything that made men human and replaced it with smoke. The sirens began at 11:30 p.m., shrill and endless, echoing through the narrow streets of Cologne. For weeks, the city had lived under the constant fear of raids. But this night felt different. The ground itself seemed to tremble before the bombers even arrived. In a small apartment near the cathedral, a mother woke her 2 children, wrapping them in blankets as the sky outside turned red. "Schnell! Into the shelter!" she cried, voice breaking over the sound of approaching thunder. Above the city, the first wave of Lancaster bombers appeared. Black silhouettes crossing the moonlight. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, sending streaks of orange into the night. The noise was beyond comprehension. Windows shattered before the bombs even landed. Somewhere near the river, a church bell kept ringing, its rhythm lost amid explosions. In the control room of the Luftwaffe radar post outside the city, officers shouted over static, "Hundreds of them!" Too many to count. Fighter squadrons scrambled from nearby airfields, engines roaring into the darkness. But the bombers were already there, thousands of feet above, raining destruction. From below, it looked like the end of the world. Within minutes, entire districts were burning. The incendiary bombs fell first, thin, metallic cylinders that burst into magnesium fire upon impact. The sparks scattered like stars, setting rooftops ablaze faster than anyone could react. Firefighters raced through the streets, but their water lines were cut by explosions. A German officer standing on the river bridge watched helplessly as flames devoured the horizon. The city was no longer a collection of streets and houses. It was a single, roaring furnace. It was like the sun had fallen, he would write later in his diary. The air itself caught fire. Luftwaffe fighters finally reached the skies above Cologne, but the bombers flew in perfect formation. A living machine, too large to attack head-on. Pilots dove through the flak bursts, firing desperately, but the British formation barely wavered. Every minute brought another explosion below. Every second, another life ended. Inside the shelters, people prayed. The heat seeped into the ground. The air became hard to breathe. Mothers pressed their children close, whispering that the noise above would soon fade. But it didn't. The bombers came in waves, relentless, mechanical, and unfeeling. At a Luftwaffe airbase near Bonn, a young pilot named Karl Hoffmann stood by his Messerschmitt, waiting for the signal to take off. The runway lights flickered as he strapped in, hands trembling. His instructor's voice echoed in his mind. "You are the last line of defense." But what could one fighter do against 1,000? As Karl took off, the horizon was already burning. He climbed higher, feeling the turbulence from exploding shells below. Then, out of the haze, he saw them. Rows of dark bombers, stretching from one end of the sky to the other. "Mein Gott," he whispered. He dove into the formation, guns blazing. Tracers ripped through the night. He saw a bomber catch fire, then explode, debris scattering like fireworks. But seconds later, 3 more took its place. His cockpit shook violently as shrapnel tore through his wing. Alarms screamed, but he didn't turn back. "For Germany!" he shouted into the radio. No one answered. Static. When his plane finally hit the ground minutes later, he crawled out of the wreckage, dazed and half-deaf. Above him, the bombers continued northward, unstoppable. The fire in the sky reflected in his eyes as he realized the truth. This was a war Germany could no longer win. When dawn arrived, the smoke still hung over the Rhine like a dark ocean. Entire neighborhoods had vanished overnight. The cathedral's spires stood tall but blackened, its windows shattered into glittering shards. Streets that had been home to families for generations were now endless fields of ash. Civilians wandered through the ruins, calling out names, brothers, mothers, children, hoping someone would answer. Firefighters moved silently, searching for survivors in collapsed basements. "It's gone," whispered an old man, staring at where his bakery had stood for 40 years. "All of it." In the Luftwaffe command post, officers reviewed aerial photos of the destruction. Their expressions were unreadable. "The enemy has changed tactics," one said quietly. "They're not bombing factories anymore. They're breaking our spirit." Berlin's propaganda ministry would later release statements calling the raid a strategic failure for the British. But those who lived through that night knew better. There was no strategy in fire. There was only terror. Days later, the survivors began to rebuild. Trains carried refugees deeper into the countryside, away from the smoldering ruins of the city. Children clutched whatever toys they had left. Mothers carried photographs of those they'd lost. And above it all, the sky, empty now, seemed to mock them. Karl Hoffmann was found unconscious near his crashed Messerschmitt, miraculously alive. When he woke in a field hospital, his first question was not about victory, but about Cologne. The nurse only shook her head. Months later, when he returned to service, he wrote a letter to his sister. "They tell us to fight for the Reich. But after that night, I know we are only fighting to survive." The firestorm over Cologne was just the beginning. Within a year, Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin would suffer the same fate. The 1,000 bombers had proven what war in the modern age truly meant. Not armies clashing, but entire cities erased from the map. And long after the last siren faded, people still looked to the night sky with fear, remembering the night the heavens themselves caught fire. The morning after the 1,000-bomber raid, the crews began returning to their airfields across England. The hangars of RAF Scampton, Waddington, and Coningsby were filled with smoke, fuel fumes, and silence. Ground crews waited anxiously, scanning the skies for returning aircraft. Many never came back. Wing Commander John Harris stood beside his Lancaster, its wings scorched from flak damage. He watched as the bombers landed one by one, some with missing engines, others riddled with holes. When the last one touched down, mechanics counted the numbers. Out of more than 1,000, 94 were lost. Over 500 men gone in a single night. But Harris didn't speak. He only looked toward the horizon where Cologne still burned beneath the clouds. "They'll know now," he whispered. "They'll know what we're capable of." In the control tower, Air Marshal Arthur Harris, bomber. Harris, the architect of the campaign, received the first reports. The damage had been catastrophic for Germany. The raid had achieved what many thought impossible. It had shaken the enemy's confidence and proven that Britain, even under siege, could strike back. For the weary men of the RAF, it wasn't triumph. It was vindication, and a promise that the tide of war was beginning to turn. In London, the newspapers carried headlines of triumph. 1,000 RAF bombers strike at Cologne. Germany trembles. But in the officers' mess, no one celebrated. The cost was too high. Photographs of the missing crews were pinned to the wall. Young faces frozen in time. Men who had taken off with courage but never returned. "It's strange," one pilot murmured. "You hear the cheers in London, but out here, all you hear is the silence of the hangar." For every success, there was a loss that bit deep into the heart of the Air Force. The mechanics who patched the planes saw the blood on the fuselage, the torn maps left in cockpits, the letters home never sent. They knew the reality behind the headlines. And yet morale didn't break. If anything, it hardened. Pilots volunteered for new missions without hesitation. They understood now that the war wouldn't be won in a single night. It would be won through endurance, courage, and unity. The 1,000-bomber raid had proven Britain's industrial might and its unyielding spirit. Even as coffins lined the airfield, the crews prepared for the next operation. In the training bases scattered across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, young recruits listened to veterans tell stories of the raid. They spoke not of fear, but of determination. One instructor, a grizzled pilot named Edward Collins, stood before a group of recruits. "You've heard about Cologne," he said quietly. "You've seen the pictures. That wasn't just destruction. It was a message. The enemy thought we were broken. We showed them we could hit back harder than ever." The recruits nodded, eyes wide. Outside, the roar of Merlins filled the sky as bombers took off for night training. The sound was constant, a living heartbeat of the island nation. In towns across Britain, civilians knitted scarves for airmen, wrote letters to crews they had never met, and gathered at rail stations to cheer departing squadrons. They had lived through the Blitz. They knew what it meant to face fire and survive. Now, it was their turn to believe in victory again. The resolve of a people who had stood under bombs now carried upward, into the clouds, with every mission that left British soil. Summer 1943 brought with it a new kind of war. The 1,000-bomber raid had been a test. Now it became a pattern. Hamburg, Essen, and Berlin soon followed. Each mission was bigger, deadlier, more organized. The RAF learned to coordinate hundreds of aircraft using pathfinders, radar, and flares that painted targets in the night. Air Marshal Harris's philosophy was brutal but clear. We shall bomb Germany until they cannot fight. From the air, the bombers looked like a constellation, a vast moving galaxy of light and steel. The roar of engines over the North Sea became the sound of vengeance. But for the men inside those planes, it wasn't glory. It was survival. Every mission meant flying through walls of flak, through searchlights that turned the night into daylight, through German night fighters that hunted them relentlessly. And yet they flew, again and again. Each flight was a gamble, a roll of dice between life and death. Each return was a silent victory. By the end of 1943, Britain had transformed. What began as a nation defending itself under the Blitz had become a nation on the offensive. The bombers that once hid in clouds now ruled the skies. For the airmen, the mission was no longer revenge. It was duty. Every man knew that his sacrifice might shorten the war, save lives on the ground, or spare another city from the fire they had once endured. The resolve of Britain was unbreakable. From the Prime Minister's speeches to the prayers whispered in bomb shelters, a single truth echoed. They will not break us again. And as the last bomber squadron lifted off into the freezing night sky, the floodlights at the airfield dimmed. A mechanic watched them disappear into the horizon and murmured, "God go with them." The engines faded, leaving only the hum of the wind and the quiet strength of a nation that refused to fall. When dawn broke over Cologne after the 1,000-bomber raid, the city was unrecognizable. Smoke rose in silent spirals where streets had once been alive with families, music, and light. The great Gothic cathedral, though scarred, still stood defiantly amid a sea of ruin. From the air, reconnaissance pilots saw what they had done. Entire districts flattened, bridges torn apart, and fires that refused to die even after sunrise. For the German people, it was a new kind of terror. For the Allies, it was proof that the enemy could bleed. But beneath both, there was a grim understanding. Something irreversible had begun. A British officer, upon seeing the photos, whispered, "We've crossed the line from defense to destruction." The line between victory and vengeance blurred that day, and the world would never be the same again. Back in England, telegrams arrived like silent bombs. Each one carried the same cold words: "Missing in action." Mothers received them in small villages, wives in London apartments, fiancés in factory dormitories. The cost of the 1,000-bomber raid was written not in headlines, but in tears. And yet, when interviewed by the BBC, one mother said softly, "If he died flying, he died free." Her son was 22. In the mess halls, the surviving pilots didn't speak much. They drank tea, stared into their cups, and replayed every second of that mission in their minds. There were no parades, no songs, only the quiet understanding that war demands everything, even from those who survive it. In Germany, Joseph Goebbels called the Cologne attack terrorism. But privately, even Nazi officials were stunned by the scale of destruction. For the first time, they realized the war could reach deep into their heartland, and that their enemy could strike with overwhelming force. Factories halted. Civilians began to lose faith in Hitler's promise of invincibility. The myth of a 1,000-year Reich cracked under the weight of 1,000 bombers. In a bunker beneath Berlin, German officers studied the photographs of Cologne and muttered, "If they can do this once, they can do it again." And they did. Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, each raid more precise, more powerful, more devastating. The seeds of Germany's defeat were planted not just in the factories of Britain, but in the fear of its own people. The 1,000-bomber raid wasn't just a military operation. It was a declaration. It showed the world that the Allies could coordinate at a scale once thought impossible. American commanders watched closely, learning tactics that would later shape their own strategic bombing campaigns. Within a year, the United States 8th Air Force joined the skies above Europe, bringing with it B-17s and B-24s that would turn the air war into a relentless storm. By late 1943, Germany faced a nightmare. Bombers by day from America, and by night from Britain. A German general described it bitterly. "We are fighting the sky itself." The 1,000-bomber raid had been the spark that ignited a new era of warfare, one driven not by battlefields, but by engines, fuel, and resolve. As victory drew nearer, some in Britain began to question the cost. Was it justice or vengeance? The bombing of Cologne had opened the floodgates for a strategy that would soon devastate entire cities: Hamburg, Berlin, and later Dresden, where tens of thousands of civilians perished in firestorms. Even Air Marshal Harris, the man who designed it all, wrote in his diary, "War is cruelty, but sometimes cruelty is the only path to peace." Historians still debate those words. Was the 1,000-bomber raid a necessary blow against tyranny, or the moment humanity lost part of its soul? Perhaps both, for in the ashes of war, victory and tragedy often wear the same uniform. When the war finally ended, many of those who had flown that night never spoke of it again. They went home, took jobs, raised families, but the sound of the engines never left them. In small towns across Britain, memorials were built, plaques, statues, and walls of names, each one a silent testament to courage and sacrifice. At air shows decades later, old men with trembling hands would stand beside restored Lancasters, tears in their eyes as the engines roared once more. And in those moments, they weren't just remembering war. They were remembering youth, courage, and the comrades who never came home. The 1,000-bomber raid had changed the course of history, but for those who lived it, the real victory wasn't in the destruction of a city. It was in the endurance of the human spirit. Every generation inherits the lessons of war. The 1,000-bomber raid taught the world that technology and coordination could change the fate of nations, but also that power without restraint can scar humanity forever. The RAF proved what unity, planning, and willpower could achieve, but they also showed that even the victors carry the weight of what they destroy. Today, historians study the mission as both triumph and warning, a symbol of human brilliance and human cost. And as footage from that night plays in museums, the flicker of black and white flames reminds us of one truth. War may end, but its echoes never fade. In the end, the skies over Europe grew quiet again. The contrails vanished. The roar of engines faded into history. But for those who look up today, the sky still holds their memory. Invisible, eternal, vast. Every bomber that flew, every man who fell, every city that burned, they are all part of the same story. A story of endurance, courage, and the thin line between victory and loss. And as the last rays of sunset touch the clouds above Cologne, it feels as though the heavens themselves remember. For in that endless sky lies the legacy of those who dared to fly through fire and never looked back.